Hey everyone, what's up? This is Uri for Guerrilla Poker, and in this hand I'm gonna be going through a hand played by Ignacio Morales, aka Nacho, that goes a bit off the beaten path in terms of GTO and into the murky waters of hand reading. Let's get into it. This hand starts with Rainbow Kitty raising from the cutoff to 2.5x. The game is 100, 200. And Nacho 3-bets to 2100 from the small blind, standard size, roughly 4x. Anything between 4x and 5x is generally fine. We get a King 9 deuce two-tone board, and again we always want to judge how the board is for each range, and for that we need to have an idea of what the ranges look like, and generally the small blind 3-betting range is depolarized. So it's more top card heavy. It doesn't really have much 5, 6, 6, 7, A7. It doesn't hit the low cards as much, and it hits the high cards more. So King is very good. The fact that Queen, Jack, Queen 10, Jack 10 is very good. And yeah, this is, I'd say, overall a favorable board for Nacho. So he starts out with a 20% pot bet, which seems reasonable, and he's probably range betting, but we're not sure. And he faces a raise to 3-3-3-3. And makes the call. And in this spot, if you start thinking, what should my opponent be raising with? It's a good question. And the answer would be, once you bet your entire range, everything's in there. So any hand that he could potentially bet versus a check can consider a raise, right? Assuming that you just bet everything. So it's like you checked in a way, or as though you checked everything. So certainly a good king, 2-pair, a set, all of these hands are okay to consider a raise, and a bunch of draws and bluffs. And Nacho, when he calls this raise, has to be very aware of how wide he's c-betting. So in a way, he has to call a lot of hands you might not feel very comfortable calling with. He can't just say, oh, I'll just call with a king or a 9 or a flush draw and fold everything else, because he's c-betting so much, he might have to call with hands like ace-queen with a spade even. So yeah, turn 4 of hearts. Pretty bricky turn card, goes check-check. And river is the queen of hearts. And if you're thinking about both players' ranges, Nacho's range is still pretty wide. He can have spade draws, he can have all sorts of pairs, and yeah, anything that didn't fast play, so aces, 10s, maybe 8s, maybe a set, all those hands still in his range, whereas his opponent to raise flop and check turn shouldn't really have value bets anymore unless the river is a board shifting card, because all of those should be barreling the turn, or almost all of them. So if you raise king 9 or 9s or deuces, you don't check back the turn, certainly not on double flush draw. So only kind of river improves would be value for him. So yeah, queen of hearts, Ignacio checks, and I think this check is potentially reasonable with a lot of your range. Kind of what you want to be thinking is, sometimes my opponent may improve to a queen, and other than that, sometimes he's going to improve to a straight with jack 10, and other than that, he has nothing. So anything that loses to a queen, I can potentially turn into a bluff. Anything that beats a queen I can potentially value bet, but that doesn't mean I can bluff everything or value bet everything. I don't want to check and have my opponent value bet a queen. So all your hands get mixed, but it's very important to have this kind of queen X in your head when you're thinking about thresholds for what do I bluff with. So Ignacio checks, Rainbow goes all in, and Ignacio goes into the tank and makes the call, and the showdown we see is fairly surprising. So Rainbow shows up with ace of diamonds, 10 of hearts, a hand that should almost certainly have folded pre-flop, but other than that, I think is played okay-ish. I think the flop bluff raise is reasonable, and I think the river bluff maybe doesn't recognize how seldom you actually have something here, especially if you're raising hands like ace-10. Ignacio shows up with 7s with a heart, and that's a very observant call. Generally speaking, in order to call this hand, you have to have a certain thought process about your opponent, which in this case looks like it's correct. which is that he's going to raise flop fairly wide as a bluff. Doesn't have to be a gut shot or a flush draw, it can basically be anything. And then that's going to create this situation on the river where he might have a bunch of hands to bluff with, but not necessarily that many value hands, because like we said, Jack 10 suited that raised the flop, and there's not too many other hands that are going to overbet shove the river, so very, very narrow value range. And a lot of bluffs to choose from as long as you're imaginatively raising, right? And if you checked back Jack 10 suited on the turn, potentially you checked back some spade draw, and you bluff that. So it's actually a pretty nice spot to call, I think, from a hand reading perspective. I think this is probably perfectly fine. Now, we're going to do a funny thing and look at the hand in a solver. Okay, so the way I built this hand in a solver is I put in more or less the sizings that were used in the appropriate nodes, so out of position is betting only a 20% flop bet, no multiple sizes. In position to raise goes 3.5x, and I also added a tiny bit of ace-10 off 10 positions range, even though it's not supposed to be there. We could just look at ace-10 suited as well, but yeah, just because someone's playing too loose doesn't necessarily mean anything else. So yeah, flop, as I expected, we get to bet everything, and our opponent shouldn't be raising very much. But if he slow played aces, or if he has deuces and then throw in some bluffs, and is ace-10 off a reasonable bluff? Sure, if you have a spade. If you don't have a spade, you're supposed to fold. But close, it's not a big blunder. And then versus the raise, this is maybe surprising to some of you guys. Yeah, you are supposed to continue sevens with a spade. Not always, but sometimes. And you are supposed to continue ace-queen with a spade and ace-jack with a spade. You have to continue fairly loose because you bet everything. So we have a call, we have the 4 of hearts turn, we check. Our opponent, had he raised his ace-10, looks like checks back a lot, and this is the node where the way I was describing it was if he has aces or deuces, he's going to keep betting. And then he's going to check back some random hands that he doesn't feel like bluffing, you know, queen-jack, queen-10, jack-10, some of them. Ace-10 that raised, as we saw, ace-10 offsuit here that raised. So all those hands can check back reasonably. And then when we put something like the queen of diamonds in, and we look at Nacho's strat, this is kind of like I was saying, once you lose to a queen, you can potentially find yourself bluffing. And here it looks like sevens is actually just a bluff. Nacho's range is kind of strong enough to carry all these bluffs. So yeah, bluff all your ace highs, bluff sevens, and value bet. We can almost value bet ace-queen, but we kind of block the calls. But yeah, we can value bet king 10 plus. And it's good enough to go all in if you have king 10, king jack. If we do check, our opponent gets to bet very little. And his bets, there's almost no combos here. He's barely supposed to raise to begin with. But his bets kind of center around either a slow played king, or the river jack 10, or ace queen is maybe good enough for him to bet some size, like we said, because we're betting our better hands. And then he gets to throw in some bluffs, but he has to give up a ton of bluffs, because this is not, relatively speaking, a large portion of his range, so he can't bluff, you know, every airball, basically. And then when he shoves, in this case, Nacho, the way the equilibrium is supposed to go is Nacho makes him indifferent between bluffing and value betting, and there are some blocker considerations, and of course, you know, you have to call a king because ace queen is in there, but a lot of these hands are zero EV, and specifically 8s or 7s look like they're losing money, whereas yeah, even something like ace 4, which implies that when we look at this sim, there's probably, let's see if I can make these squares a bit bigger. It looks like there's some bluffs with 6s and 7s for the in-position player at some low frequency, which is not a real thing. So let's say more in reality, 7s and 8s and 10s and 10-9, and all of these hands in theory, they are zero EV calls. But when you examine the spot and you think about it, and certainly if you know your opponent's tendencies a bit, I think they can become very plus EV, and I'm fairly sure, not 100% sure, but I think there's a very decent chance Nacho here was not going off of GTO or off of a randomizer, but rather kind of hand reading and saying, you know, your value range is so narrow. I don't know if you have the King X like any real slow plays, and then it's just these Jack 10s versus the whole world that you might be bluffing with. So I'm just gonna basically range call you. And I think that might be what happened, and this might have been a really good play. So we'll wrap up the video here. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys next time.